The movie begins with Eric seated inside a police van, silently staring ahead, lost in thought. His face reflects sadness and deep contemplation as the vehicle makes its way to the prison. Upon arrival, Eric is escorted into the facility by guards who show no leniency. The intake process is harsh and clinical. Eric is thoroughly searched, walked into a private room, and made to undress. The guards meticulously examine his crevices for any contraband, leaving no room for error. Once cleared, he is handed a set of standard prison clothing. The procedures are rigid and unyielding, reinforcing the prison's strict and oppressive atmosphere. Alone and dejected, Eric is sent to his cell, where he sits with his hands on his head, overwhelmed by the weight of his situation. Despite his circumstances, Eric immediately switches into survival mode. Wasting no time, he begins crafting a weapon out of his limited resources. After constructing the weapon, Eric skillfully hides it in his cell, aware that he might need it later. The next morning, he begins his day with exercise inside his confined space, keeping his body sharp and ready. Shortly after, the guards open the doors. Earlier, Eric had attempted to smoke, but his lighter wouldn't work. Across the hall, his opposite-door neighbor lit up a cigarette. Frustrated, Eric asked to borrow the lighter, but the man coldly refused, claiming he didn't have one to spare. Later, Eric takes his plate and heads to the cafeteria for breakfast. There, tensions boil over when Eric gets into a heated argument with Yago, the inmate dishing out food. The animosity is obvious, and Eric's inability to keep his temper in check reflects the hostility of his new environment. Outside, in the prison yard, inmates are scattered about, some talking, others moving discreetly to conduct illegal business. Eric watches closely, studying the dynamics and power plays. At this moment, Neville, a dominant figure among the prisoners, approaches Eric. From the way Eric looks at him, it is clear the two share a complicated past. Neville is his father. Neville's demeanor is calm but commanding as he speaks briefly to Eric before walking back to his cell. The guards open doors for Neville, signaling his influence within the prison. Alone in his cell, Neville stares at a child's drawing taped to the wall, an innocent sketch of a nuclear family with "I love you daddy" written underneath. Back in the wing, Eric's opposite-door neighbor enters his room, reaching for something on the floor. Instinctively, Eric reacts, knocking the man unconscious. Realizing the severity of what just happened, Eric panics, fearing he may have killed the man. Desperate, he drags the unconscious body to alert the guards. Instead of listening, the guards immediately restrain Eric, showing him no mercy. Eric resists violently, fighting them off and momentarily holding one of the guards hostage. For a brief moment, it looks as though Eric might negotiate his way out, but when he realizes it's futile, he releases the guard. Despite Eric's insistence that his earlier attack was accidental, the guards show no leniency. They drag him in cuffs through the iron gates, but Eric strikes again, lashing out with sudden force, forcing the others to keep their distance. Oliver, a calm, non-operational staff member, steps in to defuse the situation. Despite orders to leave the matter alone, Oliver manages to talk Eric down. Slowly, Eric calms, and Oliver takes custody of him, leading him to segregation, solitary confinement. Later, Oliver speaks with Governor Cardew, presenting Eric's case. He explains the dangers of Eric's violent tendencies but proposes putting him in group therapy to help him channel his anger. Hayes, the head warder, objects strongly, arguing that rewarding Eric with therapy would send the wrong message. Cardew listens carefully and ultimately agrees to give Eric a chance but sets strict conditions. If he causes any further trouble, he will be immediately sent back to segregation. Eric responds with biting sarcasm, suggesting that if the therapy works for him and others, the prison staff might soon be out of jobs. Back in the wing, Neville asserts his dominance. He meets with two men in his room, smacks one of them around after a failed deal, and forces the man to make a phone call to resolve the issue. Neville's authority is unquestionable. Later, he meets with Dennis, a powerful inmate who operates from the shadows. Dennis warns Neville that Eric is causing too much disruption and makes it clear that if Neville doesn't get his son under control, Eric's life will be in danger. Neville is allowed to visit Eric in solitary, where he urges him to behave. He reminds Eric that he still has a chance to leave the prison one day, a chance that Neville admits he no longer has. When Eric is returned to the wing, tensions with Iago escalate. Eric sneaks into Iago's room, scattering his belongings and stealing some items in retaliation. Enraged, Iago sends masked attackers to ambush Eric in his cell. During the brutal attack, Hassan, a fellow inmate and member of Oliver's group, intervenes, helping Eric fight off the attackers. Eric begins to bond with Hassan and Tyrone, another group member, further irritating Neville. Neville, clearly jealous of Eric's connections, grows resentful, particularly because the men are black. At the therapy group, the inmates argue and confront their vulnerabilities. Eric begins to open up, slowly lowering his guard. Neville, however, refuses to let Eric thrive without his influence. He attends the group himself, deliberately provoking Eric and disrupting the session. Hayes takes advantage of the chaos to forcibly remove Eric from the group. He later pushes Oliver into an altercation, using it as grounds to revoke Oliver's access to the prison. Tensions between Eric and Neville finally erupt. After a confrontation in the cafeteria, Neville follows Eric back to his cell, and a brutal fight breaks out. Dennis attempts to intervene, but Eric strikes him, sending him over the rail. Guards restrain both father and son, dragging them into solitary confinement. In isolation, Neville grows agitated, calling out for Eric, terrified something might have happened to him. When Eric finally responds, Neville realizes something is wrong. Manipulating a guard, Neville escapes solitary and sets out to find his son. Meanwhile, Hayes and his men attempt to hang Eric in his cell, but Neville arrives just in time. He kills Dennis, fights off the guards, and saves Eric's life. Eric is taken to the infirmary to recover. Hassan and Tyrone attempt to check on him, showing the bonds he has formed in the group. Before being transferred out of the prison, Neville shares a final moment with Eric. He tells Eric he is proud to be his father, leaving his son with a fragile but meaningful sense of connection. For Eric, the words hold weight, signaling a small but significant resolution in their complex relationship.